If you look at the Constitution of 1787, you'll notice some strange things. Here, at least to me, is strange thing number one. The original Constitution and the first 10 amendments, aka the Bill of Rights, mentions the word citizen around a dozen times. It says that a member of the House of Representatives must be at least 25 years old and a citizen for 7 years. It says that members of the Senate must be at least 30 years old and a citizen for 9 years. It says that the president must be at least 35 years old and a natural-born citizen. But you know what? The Constitution doesn't define what a citizen is. And that's kind of important, right? After all, the definition of a citizen is someone who belongs to a particular country and has certain rights and responsibilities. One scholar, trying to figure out what the constitutional definition of citizenship was after the Constitution was ratified, wrote that it was impossible. Any historian trying to do this would be pained by a fruitless search in the law books and court records for some definition. It just wasn't there. So why'd they leave it out? Well, there's a lot of things we don't know about how the Constitution of 1787 was written. At least 3 participants kept their notes, others destroyed them. But here's my theory. At least in part, they didn't want to define what a citizen was, because then they'd have to get into the question of what a citizen wasn't and who wasn't a citizen. And if they had to talk about that, they'd have to say and use this dirty word that a lot of them didn't like to say out loud. And they were upfront about this. They didn't want that word in the Constitution, and they said so. One delegate said that that word in the Constitution would contaminate the glorious fabric of American liberty. Another confessed that he and his fellow delegates to the Constitutional Convention of 1787 anxiously sought to avoid the admission of expressions which might be odious to the ears of Americans. What expression or word was that? Well, I'll give you a hint. It was and still is, tragically, the most important word in the history of the United States. And so, the creators of the Constitution put that word into the document without spelling it out even once. First, they added a clause that allowed Americans to buy slaves from Africa and elsewhere until 1808, 20 years later. This meant that as USA people expanded from the coast, they bought 170,000 more abducted black people. Just South Carolina and Georgia imported 100,000, and the clause did not mention slavery. It said, "The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. Second, they established a principle called extraterritoriality. That is, the condition of bondage stayed attached to a person even if they escaped to a state where slavery was abolished. And again, the clause never mentioned slavery. It said, "No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due." Third, they got a 3/5 clause, in which each state, for the purpose of apportioning congressional districts based on population, would count each slave in the state as 3/5 of a person. Slaveholders wanted this because they knew that without it, they would get far fewer representatives in Congress, given that in some states, well over 50% of their population consisted of enslaved people who could not vote. And yet again, the 3/5 clause did not mention the word slave or slavery. Representation shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. Finally, the Constitution gave the national government no power to interfere with slavery in the states, under any, even the most dire humanitarian circumstances. Why did delegates to the Constitutional Convention of 1787 who disliked slavery agree to these provisions? Why did delegates to the Constitutional Convention of 1787 who disliked slavery agree to these provisions? Well, a variety of reasons. First, states like South Carolina made it clear that without these slave clauses, they would abandon the Union. These threats swayed some of the delegates. One delegate from Pennsylvania, whose name was Governor Morris, no, he wasn't the governor of Pennsylvania or the governor of Morris, that was just his first name. Anyway, he said that he felt like he was making a choice between doing injustice to human nature or offending the southern states. He chose doing injustice. Some of the delegates talked themselves into believing that slavery would gradually go away by itself, so letting it live a little longer wasn't a big deal. Some advocated for a totally impractical and immoral strategy called colonization, in which the slaves would be transported back to Africa, except that most of them by 1860, 4.5 million people, had never been to Africa. But others knew that slavery offered the North huge economic opportunities even before technologies for processing cotton were developed. And even opponents of slavery were informed by white supremacist assumptions that had been built up over 2 centuries. Alexander Hamilton expressed worry about this. He wrote to a friend, "The contempt we have been taught to entertain for the blacks makes us fancy many things that are founded neither in reason or experience." But Hamilton feared that the breakup of the USA would lead to smaller, weaker states, where uprisings by white farmers against high taxes and greedy landlords would go unchecked. So, for the sake of national unity and the security of property, he went along, as did future President James Madison, who called slavery the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man, yet he assured Virginia slaveholders that the new Constitution would offer slavery better security than anything that now exists. The creators of the Constitution of 1787 accomplished all this without saying the word slavery once in the document. They didn't want to say it out loud then, and lots of people still don't want to say it out loud now. In September of 2025, the White House ordered the National Park Service to take down materials related to slavery and indigenous Americans. This included an 1863 photograph of a formerly enslaved man with scars on his back that became one of the most powerful images of the Civil War era. And the president even complained that the Smithsonian Institution was spending too much time talking about slavery and how bad it was. How are we ever going to deal with the legacy of slavery if we won't even admit that the word exists?